I am going to tell one story now that still makes my hands shake. It was November of 1910. I was not born yet, of course. But my father told me this story when I was a young girl, and his father told it to him. So listen carefully. A private rail car slipped out of a train station in New Jersey after dark. No manifest, no press, no reporters hiding in the bushes. The men inside used only first names for the entire trip, like children playing a game. When they arrived at their destination, a remote island off the coast of Georgia, they told the caretaker staff they were on a duck hunting trip. But here is the strange part, dear. Not one of them had brought a gun. Not one. Now, what happened over the next 9 days on that island? Jekyll Island, they called it, did not appear in any newspaper. It was not debated in any Senate chamber. It was not put to a public vote. And yet, what those 7 men designed in secret would reach into every wallet, every mortgage, every paycheck, and every debt in the United States for the next 114 years. And the families behind those men, they are still there. Different names on some of the doors, but the same hands on the levers. Let me tell you about the island first. Jekyll Island in 1910 was owned entirely by a private club. Membership was invitation only. Rockefellers, Morgans, Vanderbilts, Astors. The richest families in America used it as a winter retreat, a place where the rules of public life simply did not apply. No reporters, no nosy neighbors, no politicians asking questions. Senator Nelson Aldrich chose that island for a very specific reason. He was not choosing it for the scenery, no matter what the history books say. He was choosing it because nothing that happened there would leave the island unless those men decided it would. And Aldrich was not a neutral party. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller Jr. the year before. He was a bridge, a man standing exactly at the crossroads of government power and private wealth. Now, who were these 7 men? I will tell you their names, and I want you to remember them. Frank Vanderlip was the president of National City Bank. That institution would eventually become Citigroup. Henry Davison was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Charles Norton ran First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong ran Bankers Trust, another Morgan operation. Arthur Shelton was Aldrich's personal secretary, and his only job was to make sure nothing was written down carelessly. And then there was Paul Warburg. Pay attention to this name, dear. He was a German-born partner at Kuhn, Loeb, and Company. He was the main brain behind the whole plan. Warburg had studied the central banking systems of Europe for years. He understood the Bank of England. He understood the Reichsbank. He understood something very simple but very powerful. Listen to me now. The ability to create money, to control its supply and its cost, is not merely an economic function. It is the foundation of political power itself. What did these men produce during those 9 days? They produced a draft of legislation. That draft would become, after some small changes, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. They created a central bank for the United States, a privately controlled institution with the legal authority to issue currency, set interest rates, and act as the lender of last resort to the entire national economy. And they called it the Federal Reserve. But here is the trick. Neither word in that name is fully accurate. It is not federal. It is not a reserve. It is a private bank pretending to be a government institution. Senator Aldrich took their plan to Washington the following year. It failed, not because the design was bad, but because the public had grown suspicious of anything with Aldrich's name on it. So what did the men do? They waited. They waited for a new administration. They changed some of the language. They removed Aldrich's name from the title, and they passed the same essential structure under President Woodrow Wilson in December of 1913. Years later, Frank Vanderlip, One of the men in that private rail car admitted everything in a 1935 interview with the Saturday Evening Post. He said yes, the Jekyll Island meeting had happened. Yes, it was the origin of the Federal Reserve. And then he said something that still gives me chills. He said they had been as secretive as any group of conspirators. That word, conspirators, is not my word, child. It is his word. One of the participants chose it for himself. Now, here is what the official history books want you to believe. They want you to believe that the Federal Reserve was created by well-meaning legislators to stabilize the economy after a series of banking panics. They want you to believe that the families involved were just civic-minded industrialists who wanted a more rational financial system. They want you to believe that what happened at Jekyll Island was an unusual moment, an anomaly that has since been corrected. But what if the anomaly is the story they told us afterward? The Rockefeller family did not arrive at power in 1910. John D. Rockefeller had already built Standard Oil into a monopoly that controlled 90% of American oil refining by 1880. The Sherman Antitrust Act forced a breakup in 1911, just 1 year after Jekyll Island. But those successor companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, eventually became ExxonMobil, Mobil, and Chevron. The Rockefeller family kept control through interlocking directorships and trust structures designed specifically to survive legal attacks. The Morgan line is no different. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, just months after the Federal Reserve was created. But his firm survived him. J.P. Morgan and Company absorbed Chase Manhattan in 2000 to form J.P. Morgan Chase. That is now the largest bank in the United States by assets. The firm Henry Davison, represented on Jekyll Island, manages over $3 trillion today. The Morgan family's fingerprints are not on the glass anymore. They are baked into the glass itself. The Warburg connection runs even deeper. Paul Warburg's brother, Max, ran the Warburg banking house in Hamburg, which advised the German government during the First World War, while Paul's institution in New York helped finance the Allied side. The same family, both sides of the war. That is not coincidence, dear. That is design. I have lived long enough to see that the world we were handed is not the world that was built. Somewhere between the official stories we are told in school and the reality of who holds power, there is a pattern. And that pattern is not random. It is managed. The families at Jekyll Island did not invent this model. They inherited it. The central banking concept that Warburg brought from Europe did not start in 19th century Germany. The Bank of England was founded in 1694 by a group of private creditors who lent the crown money in exchange for a charter giving them the right to issue currency. The identity of those original creditors has never been fully made public. The institution they founded still exists. It still sets monetary policy for the United Kingdom today. When you look at the families connected to the Bank of England's founding, you find the same surnames cycling through centuries of European finance, through the funding of wars, through colonial trading companies, through the establishment of every major central bank on the continent. The Rothschild family alone financed both sides of the Napoleonic Wars and held the bonds of at least 5 European governments at the same time by 1820. Nathan Rothschild said plainly that he did not care who sat on England's throne as long as he controlled the money supply. The money supply. That is the exact phrase that connects Jekyll Island to every century before it and every year after. After the Federal Reserve was established, the families who designed it moved into the industries that would define the 20th century. The Rockefellers funded the development of the pharmaceutical industry through the General Education Board and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. They helped write the Flexner Report of 1910, the same year as the Jekyll Island meeting, which restructured American medical education away from herbal and homeopathic traditions and toward petrochemical-based drug therapies. The industries they stood to profit from were the same industries their own reports recommended. The Morgan interest spread into media and communications. AT&T, the telephone monopoly, had Morgan financing. The Morgan interest spread into media and communications. AT&T, the telephone monopoly, had Morgan financing. General Electric, which eventually owned NBC, had Morgan financing. The concentration of mass communication into a small number of Morgan-connected hands happened not because of market efficiency, but because of coordinated capital deployment. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the system was self-sustaining. The banking families no longer needed to sit in private rail cars. Their institutional descendants, the foundations, the investment firms, the interlocking board structures, moved capital the way water moves through a pre-existing channel. And that channel had been cut at Jekyll Island, and in the Bank of England's founding charter, and in every financial architecture those invisible creditors had assembled across the centuries. The names you see at the top of today's financial system are not strangers to this story. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street together hold controlling stakes in nearly every major corporation on Earth, including each other. Their largest shareholders trace directly back to the institutional lineages built by Morgan, Rockefeller, and Warburg money. BlackRock was built in part with capital from men who came out of Lehman Brothers, itself a Kuhn, Loeb affiliate in the network Paul Warburg operated within. What is known is that BlackRock and Vanguard are the top two shareholders in each other, in every major bank, in every major pharmaceutical company, in every major media company, and in every major defense contractor. The industry concentration that the Jekyll Island men began building in 1910 now covers almost the entire formal economy. That is not a natural outcome, child. Markets do not naturally produce that kind of concentration across every sector at the same time. What produces that outcome is coordinated multi-generational capital management by institutions whose structure insulates them from political accountability. Every official history of this period will tell you that the Progressive Era was a time of trust-busting and democratic reform. On the surface, that is partly true. Standard Oil was broken up. The income tax was passed. The Federal Reserve was created with congressional oversight provisions. But look closely at each reform, and you find the same families positioned on both sides. Rockefeller interests held stakes in every Standard Oil successor. The income tax did not apply to tax-exempt foundations. The very vehicle the Rockefellers and Morgans were already building, the congressional oversight of the Federal Reserve, has amounted to the Fed chairman testifying twice a year to legislators who receive enormous contributions from the financial sector. The reform and the power structure it was meant to reform were both carefully managed by the same hands. Here is what gets buried in that history. Before the Federal Reserve, the United States had a tradition, contentious and imperfect, of resisting centralized banking. Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States in 1833. He called it a den of vipers and thieves. Abraham Lincoln issued greenbacks, government-created currency that bypassed the private banking system entirely to finance the Civil War. Lincoln was assassinated 6 weeks after the war ended, and the greenback system was dismantled within a decade. I am not saying one thing caused the other, but I am saying you should notice the pattern of centralization, resistance, and the elimination of that resistance runs through American financial history like a straight line. Jekyll Island was not the beginning of that line. It was the point at which the line was made permanent. What they built in 1910 has not been dismantled. It has not been reformed in any structural sense. It has only grown. The families that sent representatives to that island did not lose their position when the legislation passed. They became the legislation. Their institutional descendants define the terms on which every American, and through the dollar's reserve currency status, every human being on Earth participates in the global economy. The hunters who never brought guns to Jekyll Island were hunting something. They caught it, and more than 100 years later, nothing on the menu has changed. So now I want you to ask yourself something. How many institutions in your life were built before you were born, will exist after you are gone, and have never once asked for your consent? Your bank, your currency, the interest rate on your mortgage, the price of the medicine your family depends on, the news presented as objective, the candidates you are allowed to vote for, both funded by the same investment firms. None of these systems appeared naturally, child. Every one of them was designed in rooms you were not in by people whose names do not appear in the textbooks your children carry. Jekyll Island is not the whole story. It is just one well-documented moment when the curtain slipped, and I have lived long enough to tell you this. Pay attention to what was visible in that gap, because the families that sat in that room are still sitting. They just moved the table somewhere you cannot find it.